On October 10, 2014, 37-year-old Rico Harris began a drive that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. A former member of the Harlem Globetrotters, Harris stood 6 foot 9 inches tall and weighed roughly 300 pounds. A physically imposing figure who had once traveled the world playing professional basketball. After struggling for years with alcohol and substance abuse, he had recently entered recovery. Friends and family believed he was stabilizing in his life. He had reconnected with loved ones and was preparing to relocate from Southern California to Seattle to live with his girlfriend, Jennifer Song. In the late hours of October 9th, Rico left his mother's home in California. He planned to make the roughly 1,000-mile drive north overnight so he could arrive in time for a job interview. Throughout the night and into the early morning hours of October 10th, Rico remained in contact with Jennifer by phone. He sounded tired, but optimistic. Around 8 a.m., he told his mother he planned to stop near Sacramento to rest and get something to eat. At 10:44 a.m., Jennifer received a final text message from him saying, "Sorry I missed your call. I'm doing well." And after that, all communication stopped. When Rico failed to arrive in Seattle and calls went unanswered, concern grew quickly. 2 days later, on October 12th, a Yolo County Sheriff's deputy located Rico's black Nissan abandoned near a rest area along Interstate 5, roughly 60 miles north of Sacramento. The vehicle was out of gas. The battery was dead. Inside, personal items were scattered about: credit cards, identification, and miscellaneous belongings. But there were no obvious signs of violence. Search efforts began almost immediately. Authorities deployed canine units, helicopters, and ground teams to comb the surrounding fields and agricultural land. The terrain in that area of Yolo County consists largely of farmland, an open space bordered by waterways and patches of dense vegetation. Approximately 1,500 feet from where his vehicle had been discovered, searchers located Rico's backpack. Inside were jumper cables and his cell phone. The contents of the phone added an unusual layer to the case. Investigators recovered several short video clips recorded on the night of October 10th. The videos appeared accidental. The camera pointed loosely around the interior of the car. In the footage, Rico could be heard singing along to the music, tearing papers and tossing compact discs. One still photograph showed him standing in front of a Yolo County road sign, suggesting he had exited his vehicle at some point. There was no clear indication of distress, but some observers could describe his behavior as erratic. Authorities acknowledged Rico's past struggles with addiction. Some investigators theorized he may have relapsed, became disoriented, and wandered into the surrounding fields. Given the vast rural landscape and fluctuating weather conditions, it was considered possible he succumbed to exposure. However, the scale of the search raised additional questions. Dogs reportedly tracked his scent for a distance before losing it. Law enforcement canvassed nearby truck stops and businesses for surveillance footage, but no confirmed sightings were documented. In the weeks following his disappearance, multiple alleged sightings were reported across Northern California and even in other states, but none were verified. In December 2014, authorities stated there was evidence suggesting Rico may have returned to the area near his abandoned vehicle approximately a week after he initially vanished, based on later phone activity. However, details of that evidence were not extensively disclosed, and it did not lead to any confirmed breakthroughs. Despite continued efforts by family members, including organized searches and public appeals, no remains have been recovered. No confirmed evidence of foul play has ever surfaced. No financial activity or phone usage consistent with voluntary disappearance has ever been documented. The central question remains unresolved. Did Rico experience a relapse and wander into the fields? Did he encounter someone after leaving his car? Was there an accident that simply went undetected in the vast rural terrain? His vehicle was found. His phone was found. His backpack was found, but Harris was not. More than a decade later, there are still no confirmed answers, and the case remains open. On February 25, 2014, the body of 64-year-old Alan Geel was discovered on Porth Beach in Cornwall, England. The circumstances were deeply unusual. He was found naked. A sock and a set of Apple earphones were inside his mouth. Nearby, police located a jacket and a wallet containing cash. There were no obvious signs of a robbery. Post-mortem examination revealed multiple injuries, though none conclusively explained how he died. There was no clear evidence of drowning or fatal asphyxiation. Suicide was considered, but not definitively proven, nor was homicide. CCTV footage shows Alan hours earlier wandering after taking a bus several miles from home. He appeared alone, moving without urgency, at times speaking to individuals who have never been publicly identified. Some clothing seen in CCTV footage was never recovered. He had recently purchased ankle weights and a weighted vest, items that were also never found. Police stated they found no clear evidence of third-party involvement. The case remains officially unexplained. Why remove clothing? Why the earphones? Why purchase weighted equipment shortly before death? Without definitive forensic answers, speculation can only fill the gaps. When detectives began dissecting Alan Geel's final movements, what stood out most was not chaos, it was structure. Transport records showed his bus journeys were spaced with waiting periods long enough for reflection. He was not rushing. He was not fleeing. He was navigating public spaces calmly, blending into ordinary patterns. That kind of composure complicates theories of sudden distress or impulsive behavior. Investigators later examined phone mass data in an attempt to trace his missing mobile device. While precise triangulation could not be achieved, no outgoing calls or unusual digital activity were recorded after he left his home area. There was no evidence of distress messages, no last-minute financial activity, no sudden cash withdrawals. The digital silence begins before the physical mystery does. Another undiscussed component is the section of coastline, the strong Atlantic currents and shifting tidal patterns. Marine specialists were consulted regarding the possibility of items being pulled offshore. While tides can carry objects out to sea, they do not selectively remove specific belongings while leaving others untouched. The absence of certain items, including electronic devices, remains statistically unusual. Forensic pathologists also evaluated whether his injuries could have been sustained from falls against rock formations, which is common along the coastline. However, the injury patterns did not clearly match a single catastrophic fall, nor did they align cleanly with prolonged assault. They were described as consistent with multiple impacts, but without definitive sequencing. In unexplained deaths, lack of sequencing often prevents investigators from distinguishing cause from consequence. There was also behavior profile conducted. Friends and acquaintances described Geel as independent, physically active, and health conscious, consistent with his recent purchase of weighted exercise gear. Detectives explored whether that purchase was fitness-related or something more symbolic. No suicide note was ever found. No prior mental health flags were formally recorded. One investigative avenue examined whether he could have encountered someone after arriving at the coastline, possibly someone not captured on CCTV. If third-party involvement occurred, it would likely have taken place in one of those blind zones. Yet police never publicly named a suspect. No DNA profile was announced. No arrest was ever made. And importantly, the case was never formally classified as a homicide. By late 2014, the active intensity tapered off, but the file remained open. In cases like this, absence becomes its own form of evidence. No witness ever came forward claiming a confrontation. No fisherman ever reported recovering belongings offshore, and no hospital treated a suspect with unexplained injuries. And so the case rests in a rare category: not ruled a suicide, not ruled accidental, and not ruled a murder. Just a man whose final documented movements show deliberation, whose injuries show ambiguity, and whose missing possessions suggest an unseen variable in the equation. In forensic investigations, uncertainty is common, but sustained total uncertainty across physical, digital, and testimonial evidence is far less so. Allen's death remains one of the United Kingdom's most perplexing modern unexplained cases. On June 23, 1965, Houston police entered a quiet home after relatives reported being unable to contact Fred and Edwina Rogers. What they found inside became one of the most infamous murder scenes in American history. Inside the refrigerator were neatly stacked cuts of meat, but at the bottom, through the vegetable drawer, officers saw what looked like 2 human heads. After further inspection, the heads belonged to Fred and Edwina Rogers. Their bodies had been carefully dismembered and cleaned. Organs were missing and later discovered in the sewer system. Blood evidence inside the home was minimal, suggesting the scene had been meticulously managed. Their 43-year-old son, Charles Rogers, who lived with them, was missing. Autopsy reports showed that Fred had been beaten with a hammer. Edwina had been beaten and shot in the head. No signs of forced entry were found. Charles immediately became the primary suspect. He was never located, and over the decades, rumors swirled that Charles had CIA connections or fled to Mexico. None of these claims were substantiated, but in 1975 he was declared legally dead. Whether Charles Rogers committed the murders or met some unknown fate himself remains unsolved. The calculated precision of the crime, the lack of evidence, and the disappearance of the prime suspect cemented the Icebox murders as one of the most disturbing, unsolved cases in Texas history. What rarely gets discussed about this case is the timeline gap. Investigators later determined the murders likely occurred several days before discovery, possibly as early as June 20th. That window suggests something chilling. The killer remained inside the house for an extended period of time after the murders. Utility records showed water usage consistent with prolonged cleaning. Detectives believed the bathroom had been used extensively, possibly to wash body parts before storage. The level of sanitation pointed toward patience and emotional detachment rather than panic. Charles Rogers' background added another unsettling layer. Former associates described him as socially withdrawn, but highly intelligent. He had worked in fields involving seismic data and technical drafting. While CIA rumors remain unproven, Houston police did confirm he had specialized scientific training uncommon for the average suspect in a domestic homicide. Another overlooked detail: the hammer used to kill Fred Rogers was found inside the home. It belonged to the household. That suggests the murders were not pre-planned with outside weapons. But it does not rule out premeditation. If Charles committed the crime, he may have escalated during a confrontation and then methodically transitioned into calculated dismemberment afterward. There was also no evidence in financial gain. Bank accounts were untouched, no large withdrawals, no identity theft. If Charles fled, he did so without exploiting his parents' money, which complicates the motive. Perhaps revenge, or a psychological breakdown, or perhaps something rooted in years of private domestic tension. Houston police officially named Charles as the primary suspect, but never issued a murder conviction. No confirmed border crossing records were ever publicly produced, and despite decades of alleged sightings in Mexico and Central America, not one fingerprint, not one dental record, not one body has ever confirmed his fate. The Icebox murders endure not simply because they were grotesque, but because the prime suspect vanished into history with no forensic trace of his escape whatsoever. In the early hours of December 8, 2000, 22-year-old Trevor Deely stepped out into the rain-soaked streets of Dublin and vanished. Trevor had been working at Bank of Ireland Asset Management on Haddington Road. By all accounts, he was dependable, quiet, and well-liked. On the evening of December 7th, 2000, he attended his company's Christmas party with colleagues. The celebrations began at the Hilton Hotel and moved through several pubs and clubs in the city center. Witnesses later confirmed that Trevor appeared in good spirits, drinking, socializing, nothing out of the ordinary. At approximately 3:25 a.m., CCTV captured Trevor leaving Buck Whaley's nightclub on Leeson Street. Dublin was experiencing a taxi strike that night, and heavy rain was falling steadily. Rather than heading straight home, Trevor walked back to his office on Haddington Road, arriving about 4 a.m. He rang the bell and was led inside by a co-worker who had been working late. The two spoke briefly, and Trevor sent emails from his desk. He also borrowed a black umbrella from the office. At 4:14 a.m., CCTV recorded Trevor leaving the building. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Trevor. Footage from outside the building earlier shows an unidentified man lingering near the rear entrance shortly before Trevor arrived. That same individual was not visible when Trevor exited. Then roughly 30 seconds after Trevor passed a nearby ATM camera on Haddington Road, another man carrying an umbrella appeared on the footage, walking in the same direction Trevor had taken. Whether this was the same man seen earlier has never been conclusively determined. Trevor's route home would have taken him across Bagot Street Bridge, over the Grand Canal, and onward toward his apartment in Ballsbridge, less than a 30-minute walk. However, he never arrived. When Trevor failed to show up for work, concern mounted quickly. A massive search operation followed. Investigators combed the Grand Canal and the river. Divers searched repeatedly. Nothing was found. No umbrella, no wallet, no trace of the young banker whatsoever. In the years since, investigators have pursued several lines of inquiry. One theory suggested that Trevor may have fallen into the canal accidentally, but the absence of a body after extensive searches raised doubts. Others questioned whether he encountered foul play. The unidentified man, seen on CCTV, has never been publicly identified, despite appeals and enhancements of the footage. In 2009, investigators reclassified the case from a missing persons inquiry to a murder investigation, citing the length of time without evidence of life and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the CCTV footage. In 2017, investigators released enhanced images of the man seen near the office building in hopes of identifying him. No definitive breakthrough followed. Trevor's family has remained vocal and persistent. His parents, Michael and Ann Deely, have continued public appeals for information, marking anniversaries with renewed calls for witnesses to come forward. Over 2 decades later, the case remains open. Trevor gave no signs that he intended to disappear. He had recently returned from a trip to Australia, was steady in his job, and maintained close relationships with friends and family. His bank accounts were untouched. His passport was never used. It was as though he dissolved into the rain between Haddington Road and his front door. The most haunting element remains the timing. The city was quiet. Streets were slick and largely empty. The camera showed Trevor walking calmly, umbrella overhead, hands in his pockets. There is no visible distress, no sign of urgency, just a young man heading home after a Christmas party. And then, nothing. More than 25 years later, the question persists. Did Trevor Deely meet with misadventure in the dark waters of Dublin, or did someone cross his path that night? Someone who has remained silent ever since. The footage still exists. The umbrella still swings in the grainy frame. And somewhere between 4:14 a.m. and sunrise, Trevor Deely disappeared into one of Ireland's most enduring mysteries. On January 11th, 2013, 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson was found dead inside the gymnasium of Lowndes High School in Valdosta, Georgia. His body was discovered head first inside a rolled wrestling mat. Investigators concluded that he had climbed into the mat to retrieve a shoe and became trapped, dying of suffocation. The ruling was deemed an accident. Kendrick's family strongly disagreed. They hired a private pathologist. The second autopsy fueled national controversy. Questions arose about missing surveillance footage. Approximately 3 hours of video were reportedly not recorded due to system motion activation settings. Over 290 hours of footage were eventually released to the public. The size of the mat opening and the logistics of how Kendrick could have entered it have been debated extensively. Investigators maintain that the space was flexible and that the students routinely stored shoes inside the mats. Allegations involving classmates, including 2 brothers whose father was an FBI agent, circulated online. Law enforcement investigated these claims, but stated there was no insufficient evidence to pursue charges. In 2015, Kendrick's family filed a $100 million wrongful death lawsuit, which was later dismissed. Federal authorities reviewed the case and found no evidence of civil rights violation or homicide conspiracy. Despite official rulings, public debate continues. For his family, the unanswered questions overshadow the conclusions. Whether a tragic accident or something darker, the divide between official findings and family belief has kept this case alive in the public consciousness for more than a decade. One of the most debated forensic issues in this case centers on the settling of blood after death. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation countered that the decomposition changes and vertical suspension could account for those patterns. Another focal point was the condition of the internal organs. During a later examination, it was discovered that certain organs had been replaced with newspaper during the funeral home preparation process, a practice not uncommon in some mortuary procedures, but one that certainly fueled the public's suspicion once it was revealed. Federal authorities conducted a civil rights review that included interviews, re-examination of digital evidence, and review of alleged threats circulating online. Ultimately, it was concluded that they were insufficient of evidence of foul play. The case was reopened multiple times, most recently after news tips surfaced in 2021. Each review reaffirmed the original accidental classification. But beyond the legal rulings, this case became symbolic, not purely forensic. It intersected with distrust in institutions, online amplification, and national media coverage. Even without criminal charges, the case never faded from public debate. Officially, it is closed, but socially, it remains active. Shannon McCarson was born and raised in Rockmart, Georgia. From an early age, Shannon showed remarkable creativity and ambition. She discovered a love for painting and immersed herself in the arts, often creating vivid portraits of flowers, horses, and landscapes. But Shannon's ambitions extended beyond the canvas. At the age of 19, she earned her private pilot's license, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. By the time she was 21, Shannon was studying to become an airplane mechanic in Tulsa. But her world would soon shift dramatically. Shannon experienced a severe mental breakdown and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that forced her to give up her dreams of flying. She continued painting, though, and relied on it as a form of expression. Shannon's life became increasingly transient. She traveled frequently, moving from town to town, often hitchhiking or taking Greyhound buses to northern Florida, where she would sell her paintings for modest sums. She lived off the grid in many ways. She had no cell phone, no social media presence, and no bank cards. She survived her wits and her ability to navigate the world on her own terms, but her mental health struggles made her vulnerable, and she became somewhat of an enigma to those who encountered her. On April 4th, 2016, at age 42, Shannon arrived at the Orlando Greyhound station on North John Young Parkway. Surveillance footage captured her wearing a light-colored tank top, a scarf, and dark pants, carrying a medium crossbody bag and a brown jacket. She stepped outside the station, laid her jacket on the grass, and sat down, seemingly taking a moment to rest or observe her surroundings. Within minutes, a woman wearing a red shirt and light-colored shorts approaches Shannon. The two engage in a brief conversation. What they discussed remains unknown, and the woman's identity has never been established. Shortly after, a white car pulls into the parking lot. Whether Shannon entered the vehicle or continued walking is a mystery. 2 days later, her remains were discovered in a wooded area near Old Winter Garden Road in Orlando. Investigators determined she had been decapitated and dismembered. Her arms and legs had been severed. Authorities have stated that the woman seen speaking with Shannon is not considered a suspect in the murder, but they had hoped to learn what she said in that brief encounter. Shannon's life before her death paints a picture of someone both extraordinary and vulnerable. A painter, a pilot, and a traveler. She was fiercely independent, yet struggling with the challenges of her mental illness. Her murder shocked the local community, and the brutality of her death has left lingering questions that remain unanswered to this day. The case continues to baffle authorities, despite the passage of time. There are no known suspects, and the motive for Shannon's murder remains unknown. A $10,000 reward has been offered for any information leading to the identification of the perpetrator. But as of now, Shannon McCarson's story ends in a chilling silence. Her brilliance and life cut short, leaving a trail of mystery and unanswered questions in her wake. Between June 12th and June 16th, 2009, an unidentified elderly man with a strong accent arrived in a coastal Irish town and went about a series of peculiar actions that would ultimately lead to a mystery still unresolved by investigators. The man checked into the Sligo City Hotel under the name Peter Bergman, paying for his stay entirely in cash. A curious choice in itself. Over the next few days, CCTV footage captured him wandering through the town, visiting the hotel and walking along the streets, interacting with local life, yet no one ever came forward to identify him. On one of the first mornings of his stay, he was seen leaving the hotel carrying a distinctive purple plastic bag. But when he returned later that day, the bag was gone. Investigators believe that the man may have began systematically discarding his personal belongings, carefully and intentionally avoiding CCTV cameras as he did so, perhaps to conceal his identity or erase his past. On June 16, 2009, the man's life and mystery came to an abrupt end. He checked out of the hotel carrying 2 black bags and the same plastic bag he had used earlier in the week. He walked to the local bus station and then into a nearby coffee shop where the footage shows him pulling out a piece of paper from his pocket, reading it, and then tearing it up. Later that afternoon, he boarded a bus bound for Rosses Point Beach, a coastline nearby. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing him pacing the beach, behaving in an unusual and detached manner. It was on that same stretch of sand that his body was discovered later that day. With no identification, no wallet, no phone, and no clues as to who he really was. All labels had been removed from his clothing, and nothing on his person offered any hint of his identity. An autopsy found no signs of foul play, and no evidence of drowning in salt water. However, investigators discovered that the man was suffering from advanced prostate cancer and multiple bone tumors, and astonishingly, no drugs, including pain medication, were found in his system. This suggested he was potentially enduring some significant pain. Earlier in the week, CCTV footage showed the man stopping at the local post office, where he purchased 8 postage stamps and airmail stickers, presumably to send letters to people important to him, though none of those letters have ever been publicly recovered. Despite extensive efforts to trace his identity, including international inquiries and fingerprint checks, no match has ever been found. The alias, Peter Bergman, has turned up no records anywhere, and the man remains officially unidentified to this day. The most widely accepted theory is that he traveled to Ireland with the intention of taking his own life, a deliberate and solitary choice marked by his disposal of personal effects and his obscure movements. But the question that haunts investigators and the public alike is, who is he? Why did he go to such lengths to conceal his identity? And what final message did he intend with those unseen letters? To this day, this case remains one of Europe's most perplexing, unsolved cases. Shortly before 6 a.m. on December 26, 1996 in Boulder, Colorado, JonBenet Ramsey was reported kidnapped by her mother, Patsy Ramsey. Patsy told police she had found a 3-page ransom note inside the family home. The note demanded $118,000, a figure nearly identical to John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus. It was signed with the initials SBTC. Police arrived quickly, but the home was not secured as a homicide scene. Friends and family were allowed inside. Hours later, around 1 p.m., John Ramsey discovered his own daughter's body in a basement storage room. JonBenet had been strangled with a nylon cord. She had also suffered a severe skull fracture. Duct tape covered her mouth. Her wrists were loosely bound. A white blanket covered her body. Autopsy findings concluded that the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with cranocerebral trauma. There was also evidence consistent with sexual assault. The ransom note had been written on paper from inside the Ramseys' home using a pen that also belonged to the family. Handwriting experts were divided. No conclusive match was ever confirmed. Early suspicion focused heavily on the Ramsey family due to the absence of clear signs of forced entry. JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, and her brother Burke, were all publicly scrutinized. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney formally cleared the family, based largely on touch DNA evidence found on JonBenet's clothing that did not match any other family member. Over the years, multiple suspects emerged. In 2006, John Mark Carr falsely confessed in Thailand. DNA testing quickly ruled him out. Other persons of interest were investigated, but none were charged. The unidentified male DNA profile remains in the national database, but has not been matched by any other offender. Nearly 30 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. The Boulder Police Department continues to state that the investigation is active. What happened inside that home during the early morning hours of December 26th remains one of the most debated and analyzed crimes in modern American history.